Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I'm the sports editor for the Herald Democrat, Jason De La Rosa, and you're listening to a brand new season of the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. That's right, folks. It is 2022. Football season is about to begin. We are back at it, ready to go, week one. And for those of you new to the podcast, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. We appreciate it. And for those who have listened for the past couple years, you know what to expect. Every week, we're going to talk about the games that are coming up. And after this week, we will look back at what happened the previous Friday, talk about that, what it means for the games that are coming up the next week. Once we get into district, how that's going to affect playoffs, how that affects the playoffs when we get to the playoffs. We'll talk about all that until the last team is out. The last couple of years, we've gone almost until Christmas, talking about the Gunner Tigers and all the deep runs that they've had. And the expectations are for that to happen again. So lots to talk about every week for all our teams here in Grayson County. Always good matchups for whatever reason this year in realignment. We have a lot of all local matchups starting right off the bat in week one. And that's great to see. I know a lot of fans love the rivalries and they love to see the local teams playing each other for bragging rights. And we have several really good teams, several playoff quality teams that are going to be playing each other to kind of see how they stack up before they get into district play and to kind of test themselves for the playoffs. So that's how we go from top to bottom, biggest to smallest, and we'll do that every week here on the podcast, which normally gets posted sometime on Wednesday night. So be sure to grab that before we have some games that kick off sometimes on Thursday. So always be on the lookout. We tweet it out. We put it on the social media, and you can find it on our website, heralddemocrat.com as well. So without further ado, we will jump in to week one of the 2022 season. I will start by mentioning a couple of teams that are not playing this week. One of those, and they will not be playing for the whole season, is the Texoma Christian Eagles. Normally at the six-man level in TAPS, they have decided with some low numbers not to play a season this year. There was some talk that they might try to do a wildcat schedule and just kind of play games here and there to keep things going. But they decided to regroup, and hopefully they'll be back in the mix next season, depending on what their numbers are looking like. So we won't be talking about Texoma Christian this year because they won't be having any games. And unfortunately for week one, we will not be talking about the Gunner Tigers. The reason for that is because they had a third opponent cancel on them just a couple weeks ago, pretty short notice, and so they were unable to find a replacement, and so they will only be playing 9 games this year, assuming nothing else happens before the playoffs. And that's unfortunate because obviously every team wants to get their season going as soon as possible. Like I mentioned, this was the third time that Gunner had somebody cancel on them. They had a team lined up before realignment in preparation for the changes with districts and stuff, and that team decided to cancel right before realignment hit. So they didn't even wait to see what was going to happen, and it wouldn't have mattered because it was the the season opener. So no one was going to be in a district where they had to play every week and not have any non-district games. That team, Ferris, decided to cancel on them. So then Gunner goes into realignment, and that was the day also we had that bad weather. And so people were not in a lot of central locations. A lot of people were Zooming in, checking in on the internet, making phone calls. That affected some other people's schedules. Eventually, Gunner ended up getting Bishop. And some people may be familiar with Ferris. They're a little closer to the Metroplex. Unfortunately for Gunner, when they settled on Bishop, that's a team that many people may not know because it is nowhere near the Metroplex. We're talking, basically down by the Mexican border, and you're going to say, well, why would Gunner get them as an opponent? And part of that was because Gunner had tremendous trouble trying to find opponents. When you have as many seasons in a row as they have had, which is now 6 and counting, making at least the state semifinals in a row, you have trouble finding people that want to play you on a consistent basis. And so they were searching for opponents pretty much all over because just to get games. And Bishop was going to be one of those. They were going to play in a neutral site in Pflugerville, and so they thought they had that locked up. And then Bishop made a coaching change, and that coach decided to find somebody a little closer to home for them, not just closer to home, but also obviously a better game for them to try to have a chance to compete in. And so Gunnar had to find somebody else. And the third team that they turned to is known as Nike Dallas FC, and that is not obviously a UIL school. It's not even a charter school. I don't even really know how to describe it. It's like an IMG, but a much smaller version of IMG, where the focus is simply on athletics and arts. Theater programs, stuff like that. It's more geared towards that and schooling is a part of it, but it's not sort of the main focus. Obviously kids learn, but the focus is on football and basketball and that sort of thing. And the kids that go to those type of schools, they're going there so they can improve their status in recruiting. And it's a team that has been around for a little bit. They played Salina last year. They played several teams last year. And so Gunnar was able to pick them up to replace Bishop, which replaced Ferris. Then they decided a couple weeks ago that they weren't going to have enough people to be able to put together a competent program. And they initially canceled. They were going to play Salina again. They were going to play some other people again. And they canceled that, but they kept the Gunnar game alive. And I think Gunnar held out hope that they were going to actually be able to play that. Unfortunately, the week after they had canceled those games, they canceled with Gunnar. And of course, like we said, on short notice, Gunnar was unable to find a replacement. There were some options, but again, it takes two to tango. And unfortunately, a lot of people did not want to tango with the Tigers. And I'm of the belief it's non-district. It doesn't matter in terms of the grand scheme of things. If you're anybody playing Gunnar and you end up losing, one, I'm sure a lot of people thought you were probably going to lose to Gunnar anyway. So there's no shame in that. And if you somehow win or keep the game close, obviously that looks pretty good. That shows a lot about your team to be able to compete with a program right now that's one of the best in the state. But in the long run, so you fall to 0-1. You got 9 games left. It doesn't affect your district. It doesn't affect your playoffs. It's a game to play. And I think obviously if you feel bad for the Gunnar side, because that's 10% of the season taken away because nobody wanted to play them, and there are some other people that I don't know if they were able to find games that Gunnar was talking to, but they're willing to give up 10% of their season to not play somebody of Gunnar's caliber, and I don't understand that. I don't. You're cheating your kids, especially your seniors, who, if you don't make the playoffs, only get to play X number of times, and you just took away one of those times. So I don't get it. I understand. I do understand people like to win, and I do understand that at the end of the day, people might look at overall records and say, "Oh, you only went whatever. You went 2-8. You're not going to be the coach anymore." Or whatever record you want to throw out there. But I just think, taking that opportunity away from kids, especially on short notice, when you have an opportunity to play a game, why you wouldn't take that. But I digress. So those are 2 teams that we won't be talking about in terms of games this week. Like I said, Texoma Christian taking the season off. Gunnar, unfortunately, has to sit out until next week. And we'll preview their game next week when we get there. As well. And then as we get into this week's games, the 9 that are being played this week, I am going to leave the Battle of the Axe for last because that's the one that gets extensive coverage. So if you're looking for that specifically, fast forward a little bit towards the end. I leave that towards the end. I'll go through every other game before we get to them because of how big that is, and it always gets a little more attention. But we do have some other great games besides the Battle of the Axe this week. Like I said, the schedules are really awesome right from the jump. A lot of intriguing matchups in non-district play. And the first one we have, besides Sherman and Denison, we do have two other all local matchups this week. And we'll start with Pottsboro at Van Alstyne. Pottsboro went 6-5 last year. Van Alstyne went 8-4. These two used to be in the same district. The last time they played was 2019. And so they're a little familiar with each other. Obviously, the coaches are the same, though the kids may be different. But this used to be a really good matchup when they were in the same district together before realignment started moving them around, and obviously Van Alstyne with their growth moving up to 4A. They're about to enter their third year in 4A, while Pottsboro is still in 3A Division 1. So this is I think this is a fun interesting game. You have both teams obviously that made the playoffs last year. Pottsboro lost in the second round against a really good Malakoff team. Van Alstyne had a big bounce back year last year. They had won only 3 games the year before, making that adjustment to 4A. And they ended up going 8-4 by getting to the second round and before losing to Monahans. Both teams are adjusting to some changes, specifically at quarterback. There's going to be new quarterbacks for both, so I think that's obviously the interesting place for both of them. And they're going into these games too, not just with new quarterbacks, but both coaches. Coach Miller at Van Alstyne, Coach Poe at Pottsboro. When I talked to them to do the season previews, they had multiple options at quarterback. They had no problem saying that going into this game, and perhaps through part of more of non-district, they might be a 50-50 split. It may be this guy is our starter for this game, and we'll see how that goes, and we may make a change during the game, or that may mean we'll see how the whole game goes, and we may change the next game. So there's not established guys at the quarterback position, and that may be what this game sort of turns on. I will note for Van Alstyne, if they do win, Coach Miller will tie the school record for wins, which is 89. He needs one more to get there. That was set by Roy Jackson from 1952 to 1963. So that's a little historical note about. Obviously, that's going to happen at some point. He's going to tie the record and then perhaps pass that record and blow past it, depending on how good a season they have. But this is definitely an interesting matchup. Defensively, Pottsboro lost a lot of kids there, so that may be something to pay attention to. Like I said, that may balance out with Van Alstyne having a new guy at quarterback. And like I said, I think this is one of those good matchups that you like to see in non-district, because here you have a team, you have two teams in different classifications, different sizes. Van Alstyne's almost, it's approaching being twice as big as Pottsboro. And they're both playoff. They expect to make the playoffs. Pottsboro's going for its 13th playoff appearance in a row. And like we mentioned, Van Alstyne had a good streak going before they missed 2 years ago in the move up to 4A. And so it's a good test. It's right off the bat to see where we are against another good quality team in the area. And so obviously that's an interesting one to watch right off the bat. Both Pottsboro and Van Alstyne have some pretty good schedules. So this is an interesting way to kick off the season for sure. For Pottsboro playing at Van Alstyne. The other game that we have for all local matchup is Collinsville at Tioga. Collinsville last year was 4-6. Tioga last year was 5-6. And they were district mates last year. This is a non-district game because in realignment, Tioga stayed in 2A Division 1 and Collinsville dropped down to Division 2. Collinsville was right on the line. They were literally the last team into Division 1 last year, and then they slipped under the number this time. So So they are no longer district mates, but obviously right next to each other. Again, two teams that were willing to play each other. And the game last year, that Tioga won 23-13. Obviously, a good defensive battle, a close game. You have two coaches, looking to better themselves and have a natural rivalry right next to each other, and decided, hey, let's play each other because our game last year was a good quality game. And so I'm interested to see what's going to happen here. Tioga obviously coming off a much improved season from 2020. They only had the one win 2 years ago. They bumped that up to 5. They make the playoffs, and lose in the first round. But here's a team that's bringing back 18 starters. A lot of underclassmen last year for this team, and I think this is a team that is could be a dark horse, because I think a lot of people, obviously knew that they made the playoffs, but obviously you look at the record, hey, they're 5-6. It's not like they had this huge breakout year, where they win 8 or 9 games, and you're like, whoa, that's catches everybody's eye. So I think they're a little under the radar for what they have coming back. Obviously, the expectations are a lot bigger, to be able to compete for the district title, get a better seed in the playoffs, and then maybe make some noise. And then they've got the weapons to do that. They have 2 guys in the backfield, Chase Evans and Johnny Dorpinghouse, that were really good last year. There is a quarterback change there. I think we can say this about a lot of teams that we talk about. Probably maybe it's half and half in terms of quarterback changes, but the quarterback is one of the few changes that Tioga has. Hayden Hilliard is taking over at quarterback after he transferred into the program last year. Was dealing with an injury, so he didn't end up playing. And he's healthy and good to go. He was healthy by the time basketball started, and he's one of those 3 sport athletes, go from football, basketball to baseball. So he jumped right into baseball and into basketball and baseball. But this will be his first taste of football over there, and I think they think he can run the offense pretty well. And ultimately, I think the biggest thing for them, Tioga, this year is can you stand the success? Nobody expected you to do anything last year. You had 1 win. You struggled in all your other games. You lost badly. You went into last year maybe being overlooked by people. You had to earn it. You had to just go out and play, and they did that. And so now people know, hey, we can't sleep on Tioga. A lot of people they played last year, they're playing again, whether it's in district or not. That team knows, hey, they beat us last year. What are we going to do to beat them this year? So I think that's obviously the biggest thing for them is that they have to they learned how to win, but now can they handle that success? Can they handle people going into games knowing that they have to find a way to beat Tioga instead of just showing up and beating Tioga? So that's going to be an interesting thing to see with them. And with Collinsville, they had their streak of playoff appearances snapped last year. They lost on a tiebreaker. If they would have won one more game, they would have gotten in. And so that was obviously disappointing for them to not get in. But again, they're a group that has a lot of guys back, not as many as Tioga, but pretty close. They only had 1 senior on their roster last year, and they were able to get a lot of experience for a lot of freshmen and sophomores, who are now juniors and sophomores. They had a quarterback change last year. Logan Jenkins transferred in and was able to earn that job, and they're a team that has some weapons as well. When you talk about Nathan Bocadera at wide receiver, is a guy who is a 4-year starter. Carter Scott, who jumped in last year, is a big target, especially at the 2A level. He had a good year. You talk about guys in the backfield, guys like Rylan Newman, Colin Barnes. There's a lot of weapons there that if they can figure things out on defense a little bit, they're switching up the defense to be that 10-1 Salina special. If that works out for them, they could make a run, and it's a whole new district, so it's hard to project. Obviously, they're in a district with Munster, And so obviously they're projected to be the district favorite. But there's a lot of other teams in that district. It's a bigger district than the one that they were in. But I think the expectation there is that they're going to have they're going to be at least in the mix, and they probably should make the playoffs to start a new streak there. But this is it's a fun little rivalry deal right off the bat to kind of size up where you are initially. And so I think that's a fun game right off the bat with Collinsville going to Tioga. Next game, as we get to people playing other people outside the area, but still some really intriguing matchups here. The first one we'll talk about is Whitesboro going to Crum, and here you have the Bearcats coming off their best season in school history. They get all the way to the state quarterfinals, also known as the region final. Unfortunately, waiting there was Brock, who is their district mate, had already beaten them once this year, so they had to try to find a way to beat them. They were unable to do that. Brock ended up going all the way to the championship game and losing to Lorena. But still, a great season for Whitesboro. They finished 9-5. The 9 wins, the second most in school history. You can count on one hand the number of teams in school history that have gotten to at least 9 wins. They were one of them, and obviously no team in school history had gotten to the region final. A couple had gotten to the region semifinals. So great year for Whitesboro. Crum went 4-6. Did not make the playoffs. They have not made the playoffs since 2016. That was also the last time that they had a winning record. So you have this program, this 3A Division I program in Whitesboro taking on a 4A Division II program in Crum. And Whitesboro, obviously, everyone's excited. They did have some key losses, especially at the receiver spots, and a lot of those guys were secondary guys. So those are the two areas that were the hardest hit, was receiver and in the secondary. But they have a quarterback back in Mac Harper. Grayson Ledbetter is back at running back. He was off to a really good start before he got injured and missed the rest of the season. He only played in, I think, 4 games when he got hurt, but he was averaging more than 100 yards and 2 touchdowns a game. So having him back, is huge, especially when you're trying to figure out who's going to be, some of those key guys that are moving from backup roles into starting roles at receiver, to help take the load off there. And defensively, led by Sterling Garton at linebacker. He was an All-State selection last year. Had over 200 tackles. He's leading the way for a defense. That was pretty good last year. And this was, you talk about a team, testing. You talk about teams testing themselves, wanting to prepare for what's ahead in district. And the district stayed the same, so it's the same cast of characters for Whitesboro. It's Brock, it's Pilot Point, it's Boyd, Paradise, Peaster, some of those people. But in non-district, they weren't afraid to challenge themselves. They play Bells, who we'll talk about here in a second. Bells was a team that made the region, ended up going to make the region semifinals in 3A Division II. You play them and beat them in overtime after they beat you the year before. You're one of those teams that's willing to play Gunner. And again, even though you didn't win that game, you held Gunner, I believe, to their lowest. I think that was their lowest point total of the season. At 28 points. Now, like I said, you lost that game, but again, you're showing that you're competing with people. They played Aubrey, who ended up going to the region final it was in Crum's district, who ended up going to the 4A Division II region final before losing to another team in that district, Salina. So they played 3 tough opponents, who all made deep playoff runs, who all made at least the region. 2 teams. You had a team that made the region semifinals, the region final, and was a state runner-up as your 3 non-district games, and you went 1-2, but obviously in the long run it didn't end up hurting you, because you had enough talent. You were talented enough to take on those teams, and I think obviously everybody is feeling the same about this group. A lot, like I said, with a lot of those guys back, to go on that deep run. And the one thing Coach Fagan said, the biggest thing when you're trying to get ready to replace, some of the guys that you have to replace, like a Jake Hermes, like a Torren Nagelstad, like a Paul Velton, is every round that you go deeper, it's another week for the JV kids to practice, for the freshmen to practice. And if you get to the state quarterfinals or the state semifinals, that's an extra 4 or 5 weeks of practice an experience that those kids get. It's more reps. It's just getting a better football IQ. Obviously you're getting stronger because you're doing all the lifting that you're doing for another 5 weeks. And then you're just a little more prepared because of that whole and obviously you're along for the ride as you see this team having all the success and winning every week and being a part of that. From a confidence level, from an expectation level, now you want to be part of this next group. So big things are obviously expected. Like I said, the district didn't change much. Obviously Brock is Brock. They're expected to have another really good year like they always do. And they of course are the favorites to win the district again. But Whitesboro is right there in that mix of why can't we be second? Why can't we have a competitive game against Brock type of situation? So I think that sort of the bare minimum for Whitesboro. And then of course they showed even if you get in as a 3rd seed, you can make a run. And so they know that's not if things don't go their way, that doesn't mean it's the end of the world because you didn't get the number 1 seed or even the number 2 seed. So it's going to be interesting. Obviously, like I said, Crum was better. They won more games last year than they did the year before. But like I said, they're still not I don't think a playoff team in the district that they've been in. So but it is an interesting matchup from Whitesboro's standpoint. They're kind of scheduling up a little bit to kind of see where they stand against some bigger programs. Maybe not a better program for sure, but just to kind of see where they stand based on some of the other games on their schedule as well. So that's Whitesboro going to Crum to open the season on Friday night. Next matchup is S&S at Bonham. S&S is coming off a 2-8 season. Bonham is coming off a 5-6 season. And this is the head coaching debut for the Rams, Jeff Hill. S&S took a step back last year. They made the playoffs as some remember. They made the playoffs 2 years ago. Jumped up, after being 1-19 for 2 years, for a combined 2 years. They went and won 6 games. Won in the first round of the playoffs, made the area round, but unfortunately, they lost a couple key kids to graduation. Took a step back, dropped to 2-8. However, they did have a situation where they finished 5th in their district. If they would have won against Whitewright, which is a game they lost 14-0, they would have gone to the playoffs at 3-7. They would have been the 4th seed, and who knows, if they could have sort of pulled off that magic again for the 2nd straight year. But they go 2-8. Coach Allman leaves to go be the offensive coordinator at Denton Braswell, and so here comes Jeff Hill, who was a coordinator at Hebron, and he's familiar to the area because he went to Bonham and he played for Bonham before going on to play in college and then starting his coaching career. So it's an interesting first matchup for him. And it's an interesting matchup, obviously, because you have a Bonham team that made the playoffs last year in a very good district. They won a tiebreaker to get the last playoff spot, but they haven't had they've only had one winning record since 2005. That came in 2018. So you have kids on this group that have been to the playoffs but have not had a winning record. And again, I think this is an interesting early matchup to kind of see where these two programs are. Bonham has a quarterback change. They would sling it around, and that was part of the reason for their success. They have a talented running back in Jaron Ross that I'm sure is probably gonna have a lot of the load put on his shoulders. And SNS is kind of the same boat. They have a guy in Chase Sloan who was a running quarterback. He would line up behind center and get the direct snap and take off and run people over and that sort of thing. Now he's gonna be the main running back. And again, SNS is another situation. And we can say this for a couple places that have new head coaches that had not finalized a quarterback, and SNS is one of those that potentially they were going into the season with some sort of battle rotation, however you want to say it, to where somebody had not locked that position down. So I think SNS is interesting based on their non-district schedule and kind of to see where they are. The district is basically the same. It's that Gunnar Bell's district. The only difference is that Howe dropped in and Whitewright dropped out. And again, I think SNS is probably at minimum sort of in the same boat. If you beat Blue Ridge and you beat Lone Oak, can you beat Howe to get that third spot or the fourth spot? Can you beat maybe Leonard to get the fourth spot? If you beat one of those teams, you're probably going to get into the playoffs. So they even though the record might look bad, they weren't that far away from making the playoffs again. And so like I said, this is an interesting early matchup to see kind of where they stand. I am kind of surprised, and maybe I shouldn't be, because Bonham has always been a little a bigger program, especially before they dropped down. This is the first meeting between SNS and Bonham, and I thought that was kind of weird. It's just a short, maybe not a short trip, but it's pretty easy going, down 82 to get there. And I would have figured they would have played. They've been around long enough that maybe somebody way back when would have said, hey, let's get SNS or let's get Bonham and make that work, and they haven't. So I thought that was kind of interesting that this is going to be the first meeting, and of course, like I said, the fact that Coach Hill is going back to where he played his high school ball as a head coach, and the first opportunity it comes against Bonham. That's just a fun little trivia note there. Next game is Howe going to Honeygrove. Howe is coming off a second straight 0-10 season, and Honeygrove is coming off a 2-8 season. Both of these teams have new head coaches. For Howe, you have Lance Bryan taking over. He was the defensive coordinator at Sanger. And at Honeygrove, you have a familiar face for a lot of people that are listening, because Shane Fletcher has taken over at Honeygrove after a almost 2-decade run at Leonard. So obviously a lot of local teams have either played them in non-district or have been in a district with them, especially the last couple of years. Gunnar Bells, SNS, Whitewright obviously being next door. A lot of local people are obviously familiar with Coach Fletcher. So he takes over at Honeygrove, and is trying to rebuild some stuff there. They haven't played in a decade, so obviously that's not something that we can really talk about. The biggest thing, obviously, going into this season with Howe is they are on a 22-game losing streak. They lost the last 2 games of 2019, and then they've gone 0-10 the last 2 years. They dropped down in the latest realignment to go from 3A Division 2 to from 3A Division 1 to Division 2. And obviously that's a huge deal for the Bulldogs, not just from a travel standpoint, because they were in that district with Pottsboro and Bonham, but then you were having to go to East Texas and take on the Mineolas and the Mount Vernons and the Winsboros of the world. And so it's a much better district for them to be able to compete in, much better district travel wise to be in. And so once the numbers started to come out, it was going to be obvious that pretty obvious that Howe was going to drop, and then they did. So there's a lot of optimism there. They have a lot of guys back from last year. It starts at quarterback. Austin Haley, who's a 4-year starter, has been been there from day one, and is the bell cow of that offense. He's the all-time leading passer. in Howe history. And so, they've got him back. They've got both their running backs back, Antoine Rattler and Carson Daniels. They've got receivers back. Cooper Jones is kind of a do-it-all kind of guy. They've got a lot of experience for some young guys. You look at their roster and you see, this guy obviously, Austin's a 4-year starter, but they have a lot of guys that are juniors that have been starting for 3 years. There's a lot of guys who are sophomores who started last year as freshmen. So they've got experience. They've had some tough schedules because of being in a bigger division. They've had to deal with injuries. And so I think if there was no team that was looking forward to realignment more than Howe, for the chance to drop down and be a little bit more competitive. And I think we're going to know about Howe or the early going, especially by the time district starts. They're playing a lot of local people, a lot of people that, I think, this could be a good run for them. And I know that's the hope. Obviously when you have a new coach, you don't know how that's going to go because everything's new. But this is a situation for them. They could get some early wins, build that confidence. Really build that confidence that they know they're better because their record shows it, and then be in the mix potentially for a playoff spot. So that's where Howe is, and then Honey Grove. They're going to play some local people, here in Grayson County. We'll talk about them a couple times in the next couple weeks. And again, Coach Fletcher has sort of said already, he's got a lot of young guys as well. So they're trying to build up that from that 2-8 season. And again, this is another one of those matchups early on to kind of see where are we. This team was, we're playing a team that was 0-10 last year. Oh, we're playing a team that was 2-8 last year. Are we better this year? Are we better than them? It's a good jumping off point for both of these teams. Someone's going to get a win, and someone's going to be feeling really good about going into week 2. And so, obviously, like I said, there's a lot of intrigue in some of these early games to kind of see. As you don't want to say it's too early for a measuring stick, but like I said, if somebody's going to get a win here, and that didn't have a whole lot of wins or no wins at all last year. So that's going to be an interesting matchup with Howe going to Honey Grove on Friday night. A couple more games here before we get to the Battle of the Axe. We got 3 more. I think the biggest of those 3 is Munster at Bells. Here you have 2 really good teams the last couple years. Munster went 12-1 last year before losing in the region semifinals, and Bells also went to their region semifinals. Munster was obviously 2A Division 2. Bells in 3A Division 2. They go 9-4, make the region semifinals before losing a heartbreaker in overtime to Holiday. I was looking at it when I put together these, when I put together the previews and I start looking at stuff, and you kind of forget, because it happened 8 or 9 months ago. So it's always good to refresh to kind of remember what happened, and then you look back and you go, hey, so Bells goes 9-4, again to get 9 wins, for the 3rd straight year. That's never been done in Bells to win at least 9 games 3 years in a row. And then so they do that, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you look at the 4 losses and you go, oh, they lost to Whitesboro in overtime. They lost to Gunner in district, and they lost to Holiday in non-district, and then they lost to Holiday in overtime in the region semifinals. So here's a team that opened its season and lost to a state quarterfinalist in 3A Division 1, that lost to the 3A Division 2 runner-up, and lost to a state quarterfinalist twice, once in overtime, and the only reason they didn't go further, Holiday, was of course they lost to Gunner in the region final again. So I mean, show me a team with 4 losses of that quality. I mean, that's how good this Bells team was. That and 3 of their losses, like we said, so they lose in overtime. So they lose a game by 7 points. They lose a game by 7 points, and they lose a game by 13 points in that first matchup with Holiday. So I mean, 2 of their losses obviously could be wins. They lost in overtime. That's 50-50 right there. So that was obviously heartbreaking for Bells. They've never been to the region final. I think obviously they felt that this was their best chance to get that far in a really long time. Going back to their those teams in the was it the late 90s that were really good. The teams that went 11-1, 9-2. Those teams in technically the mid 90s. That was probably their best chance to get to the region final, and they came up short. But the one thing that we know about Bells these days is, they've been consistent. They've won 9 games every year. They made the region semifinals last year. They made the region semifinals in 2019, and in between they made the area round. They went 9-3. So. That's the floor if you're at Bells these days. Is 9 wins, at least get a couple rounds deep and try to find a way to break through. They're gonna try to make the playoffs for the 9th year in a row. That's a school record that they keep. They're 8 years in a row right now is a school record. They're trying to extend that. But they're gonna do it with some new faces. When Coach West took over, this is his 4th year there. When he took over, he put a lot of sophomores in the starting lineup back in 2019. And so, those guys graduated after starting for 3 years. You have a change at quarterback. Blake Rowland was a guy who was a 3-year starter. Obviously, Bo Baker. On both sides of the and a lot of these guys on both sides of the ball. I don't want to take away from Blake for what he did at linebacker last year. But Bo Baker was a guy who been starting from day one. You have a lot of these guys that there was so much experience, so many guys who were 3-year starters as seniors, that now it's sort of like the new guard, as some of those guys have graduated. But for what Bells likes to do with the slot T, they have a ton of guys back with experience, whether it's Brock Baker, Grady Waldrop. I can't think of. I mean, they've got guys all over the place in terms of not just, hey, we got in games, we got a couple carries here or there. We're talking major experience. Stephen Hines, Hunter Allen. These are guys that when you look at their numbers, they don't look like they're the fifth best running back on that team just based on their numbers because of how productive they were. And so obviously they're going to lean on those guys that are back that have experience to try to make this thing happen again. But Bells, again, this is another team that has a really tough schedule to get ready for district. Munster is the lead off in that group. This is a team that has Munster's won at least 10 games every year for the last 9 years. They're always in the mix at the 2A Division II level. And I think they're thinking the same thing. Hey, we're expected to make a deep run. We're going to make that happen. And so. This is another fun game right off the bat. Hey, where are we as a program? Whoever wins, it's a good win, and whoever loses, it's not a bad loss because of by the end of the season, you're probably going to look and say, oh, that team did this. That team won that many games, went to the playoffs, and made a deep run. So, I applaud coaches that are willing to throw that out there right out the bat. And play each other and kind of size up where they are. So that's another fun matchup right off the bat. Munster at Bells to open the season. The next one we're going to talk about, this is I know this is we're kind of going out of order because sometimes we go chronologically, but this is a Thursday night game. Clarksville at Whitewright. This is Thursday night at 7:30. So If you're gonna go to this game, pay attention. Go on Thursday night, not Friday night, because if you go Friday night, you're probably gonna see, I guess, the JV, unless the JV's playing Wednesday, where you're gonna find an empty stadium. This is a game that got moved actually to Thursday for officials. This is hopefully is not something that comes back to bite people throughout the year, and we have to move games on the fly. But obviously, there is a worry when you start a new season, you start getting into a season with officials and the shortage. That's something that's been going on the last couple of years. Obviously, I think the COVID-19 pandemic sort of accelerated a lot of people not wanting to do it anymore, not wanting to deal with a lot of the restrictions and everything. I think a lot of people just kind of said, it's my, I've been doing this long enough, I'm going to retire from it. And then a lot of people have not filled in that void. And so this is a game that got moved to from Friday because of the lack of officials, to make sure that that they would get the group that they wanted. Both teams were 4-7 last year, made the playoffs and lost in the first round. This was a game that got played last year. White Wright won 49-0. They've actually opened the season against each other. This is the 5th straight year that Clarksville and White Wright will open the season against each other. And it's been very back and forth. They've played each other. They'd actually played a time before this, so they've played. This is the 6th meeting. But obviously they played the last 4 years, and the overall series White Wright leads 3-2. So there have been competitive games in there. Obviously last year was not. White Wright won big. They got their first shutout in 8 years. They obviously both went on to make the playoffs. So it wasn't as bad a deal for Clarksville, because they were able to kind of right the ship when they got into district play. But again, this is another one. Like I said, it's interesting because some of their games have been close. Again, we'll talk about a team in White Wright. They missed the playoffs the year before. They got in this time, and they're a team that dropped down. They're going from 3A to 2A, so they're going to be in 2A Division 1, and they're looking to make that work for them, kind of build on the success of getting the playoffs last year. They went 4-6 in the regular season. Try to be better at that. Facing Clarksville is the first step in that direction. And they have a quarterback change. They have a sophomore taking over, Alex Reeves. And so that's going to be interesting, obviously, to see. Again, this was another situation where you have a coach that goes to a school and takes over and evaluates and does all that sort of stuff, and it just so happens that that there was a core group of sophomore guys that jumped in Coach Wiggins' first year, and started the whole way. So you had a lot of experience. You had 3-year starters on in Caden Caraway. 1 year, one of those years as a receiver, but the last 2 was a quarterback. 3-year starter in the secondary. Colby Jones. Multiple year starter at running back. Zy Daniels, multiple 3-year guy. Whether it's getting carries or at receiver, also in the secondary. You have a lot of those guys that had so much experience, and they're gone. Now there are guys with experience. A guy like Chalk Bailey, who's a 4-year starter. On offensive line and defensive line. You have some guys back who burst onto the scene last year. Maverick Sartain had a huge season receiving. He's obviously going to be the go-to guy. He didn't have a lot of catches. He only had 28, but he averaged almost 26 yards a catch. So a lot of big plays are in his direction. And so the question is going to be, can they find the right mix of people to support a young new quarterback trying to get his feet wet, and be able to figure it out in time for when district starts. So again, it's another good matchup. Clarksville normally has athletes, and so I don't anticipate that the score will be as lopsided as it was last year. But I would, you never know the first game. A lot of people are figuring stuff out. You never know, early injuries, that sort of thing. But that's, like I said, that's going to be on Thursday night at 7:30 at Whitewright. Clarksville comes to town. I will be there because it's on a Thursday, and then I will do the Battle of the Axe on Friday. So I'm going to get a chance to, first 2 weeks in a row, I've got a Thursday game and a Friday game, because when we get to week 2, we'll talk about people having there's a couple weeks this year where I'll be doing games on Thursday and Friday because of the way the schedule falls. And the last game before we talk about the Battle of the Axe, Cumbie is at Tom Bean. And again, you talk about teams being able to play each other early to start the season and get some good feelings going. Here you have a Cumbie team that was 1-7 against a Tom Bean team that was 0-9. Both schools with coaching changes. For Tom Bean, that means you have Steve Fecks, who was a coordinator at McKinney Boyd. So he's coming over to try to get things turned around here. When you have a team that was 0-9, they played well in the first game last year. They go on the road out to West Texas and play a Morton team. Very tough, down to the wire. You lose 26-22. And unfortunately, that was basically the highlight of the season, because after that, it was a real struggle for the Tomcats. They only scored 3 more touchdowns the rest of the season in the other 8 games. So obviously they're shut out 5 times. And you talk about some of those scores. We're talking about 65-0, 55-6, 55-0, 70-0, 62-0. Things did not go well at all. That's an understatement. So now you have a new head coach. This is their 3rd head coach in 3 years, and he's going to try to build on something. And like I said, somebody's going to win this game. Somebody's going to win this game, and if it's Tom Bean, to do that right off the bat, obviously gives the kids a lot of confidence. And like I said, Cumbie only won 1 game last year, so they're trying to do a little something too. And I'm sure they're thinking they have just as good a chance as Tom Bean thinks they do. A lot of when I talked with Coach Fecks to preview the season, he had a lot of things up in the air about starting positions. Branson Ashlock has been the quarterback the last 2 years, so it would not be a surprise if he is again this year. But he had a lot of position battles. Basically across the roster, which makes sense. They have a lot of freshmen, a lot of younger kids that they're trying to see if they fit. And of course, why wouldn't you when the basis is the season that that Tom Bean had, to try guys at different positions to make sure that these are the right fits, at different places. So gonna be interesting to see what happens in this game, just because a lot of the unknown, and what they look like, just how better are they, based on last year. So again, like I said, there's something in all these matchups you can kind of look at and go, well, I'm interested to see what happens here. There's not a lot of I'm not real interested in that one. There's the first week is always interesting because of the fact that everything is brand new. You don't have anything to base it on. A lot can. I don't know how much you can tell in week 1, but it's football and it's back, and there are definitely some interesting matchups from the top to the bottom for our area for sure. And of course, the biggest one, the one that gets all the attention that we'll talk about now, is Sherman Denison. Oh, excuse me. It's at Munson Stadium, 7:00 on Friday. We are at the 124th Battle of the Axe. And we have a Denison team that comes in riding a 9-game winning streak after winning last year, 37-13. Again, it was a very similar script because obviously you had kids who had been starters for 3 years. That group was the epitome of I started as a sophomore, or in the case of a certain standout freshman standout running back who's now at Notre Dame, started for 4 years, that grew up together and grew together and had all the experience, and you knew when you showed up on Friday that Jadarian Price was going to be the running back, Caleb Hebner was going to be the quarterback, and Trey Rhodes was going to be at receiver along with Keegan Pruitt, and the defensive ends were going to be Ja'Kalen Fields and Landry Massenberg, and Will Wallace was going to be in the middle of the defense, and Jalik Lewis was going to be at corner, and it's all these guys that were, you saw them in 2019, you saw them in 2020, and you saw them in 2021. And so they're all gone. So you can look at the scores the last couple of years and you can say, okay, well, the people that contributed to that are no longer there. A majority of the people who were a part of 37-13 last year are no longer there. The people who contributed to 41-23 are no longer there. The people who contributed to 29-13 are no longer there. So that's good news if you're Sherman. And if you're Sherman, the good news is you have your quarterback back. Phoenix Grant is back. When you look in your backfield, your two running backs from last year, Caleb Thompson and Kane Bowen, are back. When you look at receiver, Vontrell Sanders is back. J.D. Parker is back. Aries Jones is back. So your skill guys are mostly intact, while Denison's is not. If you look at your defense, Connor Clark is back. Joe Gianfrido at linebacker is back. Chaz Brown in the middle of the defensive line is back. So when you look at returning starters, Sherman has the advantage, and it is the first game, so we don't know how are the new guys going to figure this out for Denison, because when you look at the defense, you're talking about a group that brings back 3 guys, and when you look at the offense, it's a group that brings back 4.5 guys, and 3 of the guys are on the offensive line. So that's why that's going to be. That's why I think this is the most intriguing battle of the axe that we've had probably since 2016, maybe 2017. But I think it's been that long where you went in and said, I don't really know what's going to happen. You can go in saying, I think this is going to happen, or I think this team's going to win, but you never know. Because things can happen, people can get hurt. If you're playing at Bearcat Stadium, which obviously this year we're not, weather can be a factor. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if all this rain this week, how that would have affected a game being played at Bearcat Stadium, as opposed to the game being at Munson Stadium. But so throwing all that stuff out, if you look at it just from here's this team, here's that team, what do I think is going to happen? This is the first year in a while that I sit there and I go, I don't know what's going to happen, and a lot of that is because of the positions that the teams are replacing. So we mentioned obviously, so Denison's got a new quarterback. Josh Kurtenbach, senior, takes over at quarterback. He was a receiver last year, transferred in from South Grand Prairie. His dad was a coach with Brent Whitson over there. Comes over as part of the staff, and so he comes with them. Play some linebacker, play some receiver. Now he's the quarterback. Well, again, as we talked about last year with Phoenix Grant for Sherman, his first game as a quarterback, as a starting quarterback at least, is this game, is the Battle of the Axe, hey, you're the quarterback of the team that's won 9 games in a row. You're going to be a big reason why we either win the 10th or we don't win the 10th. And so that's always interesting. But one of the bigger things is we talked about groups. Sherman's offensive line. They have a guy in Kaysen DeBose at center who got some playing time last year, so maybe he's a quarter starter. I don't know if I'd say he's a half starter from last year, but it's basically an entire new offensive line for Sherman. So while they have all these skill guys back that you think, hey, these guys are better, they've got athletes all over the place, but now they're trying to do this with a whole new offensive line. And conversely, you look at the Denison defensive line, that's all new. So you have a completely new, basically new 5 guys on the Sherman side. You've got 4 new guys on the Denison side because not only were the 4 guys last year that started for Denison seniors, the 2 main guys off the bench were seniors. So that whole thing is new. So now you have these 2 units in the trenches going against each other, and I don't know what to expect. Are we going to spend a half figuring out who's the better of the 2? Are they both they're both dealing with sort of the same thing, and it's not like you can sit there and say, well, if this was last year, Denison's defensive line is all seniors, all guys that have started before. They're going against a whole new offensive line. Advantage Denison. That would have been an obvious thing to say if that was the case. But I don't know which side has the advantage right now, because we have an all-new offensive line to look at against an all-new defensive line. And you don't want to be as simplistic as saying the team that does better on that side of the line is going to win, but that's probably going to be the case, because whoever figures it out first is probably going to be the team that has the better chance. And so it's maybe the fact that Denison is bringing back 3 starters on their offensive line, while Sherman has 3 new starters on its defensive line. Chaz Brown being the exception in the middle, being a run stuffer, big body in the middle of that line, but the 3 guys around him are new. Maybe that's the difference, because you have a center for Denison and Canyon Ives who's a 3-year guy, and you have 2 juniors in Nathan Ork and Dalton Brown, who started last year's, started every game as sophomores last year, and did a really good job. So they have all that experience, and they feel ready. They're confident and they know they can handle it. So maybe the fact that you have 3 on that side and only one of the 4 back on the Sherman defensive line, does that make a difference? It's going to be really interesting. Obviously, you have 2 defensive backs that are playmakers. Connor Clark on Sherman's side, Kenyon Kelly on Denison's side. He's a guy who jumped right in last year as a sophomore. He's got offers all over the place. He's already one of the top safeties for the class of 2024. What kind of impact does he have on this game? Because he's got the physical tools, and he's obviously shown he can. He jumped in right away last year as a sophomore and made an impact. It's going to be really interesting. I think one thing to look at too. We can probably just go position by position. We're talking about, if we're looking at both linebacker groups, that's going to be interesting, because you have a guy in Jacoby DeHorney on the Denison side, who was a starter last year as a sophomore, was on varsity as a freshman, as a junior. He's going to be flanked by 2 sophomores. This is their first game starting, on the varsity. And so that's going to be interesting to where how do those guys handle being on the big stage. Lathan Bailey and Roman Henderson for Denison, being thrown out there as sophomores, and having to deal with being a linebacker and trying to cover, these receivers and these patterns, having to come up and make tackles in the running game, and just dealing with the speed of the game. How are they going to handle it? And on the flip side, you have a Sherman group that's really athletic. I mentioned Joe Gianfrido. Was a starter last year as a sophomore. Hard hitter, likes contact. And again, you have two sophomores with him. One of them is brand new and Major Thornhill to the varsity level. The other one's going to be Kane Bowen, who got a lot more of his time on offense last year as a running back. So that's going to be interesting to see how he handles getting a lot more action on both sides of the ball. But again, you have two groups that are really athletic, but in a couple spots are very inexperienced. And I feel like this year more than any, this is the kind of game where you don't want to say one mistake is going to be the difference, but I think it could be. I think this is one of those. This is one of those. It could come down to the last couple drives for both teams, and if somebody scores to go up by 2, that's the difference. Or can somebody go down and win a game because it's 28-24 or 31-28 with 3 minutes to go, and somebody's going to go down and score a touchdown to win the game. I do think there's a really good possibility that, and in speaking of that, I will point out, from a kicking standpoint, I think obviously the edges with Sherman. Dane Castleberry's back. He was an all-district pick. He made 6 field goals last year. I think in the scrimmage the other day he made one from 42. And Denison has a new kicker. They actually have a battle. I think Ryder Poole has an edge over Matt Rangel, but that's a situation where we'll have to wait and see how the game plays out. But you have a guy on one side that's comfortable in kicking, not just in general because he was their kicker last year, but also because he, if they get on that side of the field, if they get to the 30-yard line or closer, they have no problem kicking a field goal because he's done it before. Whereas, Ryder Poole last year was a backup to Logan Voigt, and he did get in some games and he did kick some extra points and he was out there, but he wasn't the guy. And so again, this is a situation where you're asking someone in a pressure pack situation, how are they going to handle it? And that could be the difference. If it comes down to it at the end that somebody needs to make a field goal to either make it a 2-score game or tie a game or whatever, or just to keep the momentum going, because you miss that kick, the other team's like, all right, here we go, we dodged a bullet or we kept them from scoring, now we're going to go do that. So special teams could be a big thing in this game as well. And like I said, it's just so hard to predict. I really feel like if you the last couple of years, if you would have said, Denison's going to win, you could throw out a score, and you would have been right. But I think you probably would have been right just based on the fact that you had the same kids for Denison that kept showing up and kept winning, and so there was kind of no reason not to think that they were going to keep doing it until somebody stopped them. And for 4 years, and for 3 or 4 years, depending on who we're talking about, Sherman wasn't able to keep pace with them. And I do think the one thing, the way the scores have been, Sherman has had trouble putting up points against Denison. I think we did this last year too because it's kind of been the way this rivalry has gone lately. When you look at the last couple games, we're talking 13-23, 13-16, 24-30 was the game in 2016. Those who remember, that was the 35-30 game where Denison scored late, and then Sherman actually had a chance to go win that game, 37-35. but there was an interception in the end zone right at the end of the game. And before that, 14, 20, and 24. So if you go back during this whole losing streak, back to when Sherman won 3 in a row, 2010 to 2012, and they won by scoring 39, 49, 42 points. Since then, the only time they've scored more than 24 points was the closest game of this Denison winning streak by far. It came down to the last play. All the other games, Denison pulled away, third quarter, late, to win these games. Denison was putting up, 40, 42, 41, 49, 35, at least 35 points most of the time, at least 35 points, and Sherman's not getting into the 20s. And obviously that's the thing that's got to change, I think, but maybe not as much because a lot of this Denison firepower is gone. The stuff that we know you could count on, J.D. Price and some of these guys that we're going to produce along the way. Now, Denison does have a capable running back. He is not J.D. Price, and who is? In the history of Denison football, the answer to that question would be maybe 2 other guys, because, you have a guy who was one of the best running backs in the country, was a third-team All-State selection, signed with Notre Dame, unfortunately suffered an injury that is going to keep him sidelined, because otherwise he was going to play, as a true freshman this fall. You don't replace guys like that, but I think they do have a capable replacement, lined up for him in Jack Alleman, who is a junior, getting his first chance to start on a full-time basis, but was on varsity as a freshman, got called up about midway through that season, and was essentially the third running back, and got significant carries at times, in some games, and produced and made you go, that's not bad for a freshman. Obviously he's behind, 2 guys that went on to play at the, 2 guys that went on to Division I programs, Asa Osborne, who at Oklahoma State, and obviously JD going to Notre Dame. But that's a good starting point for sure. And then this year, playing second fiddle, to J.D. Price, and he only has 56 carries, and you say, okay, they played 11 games, 56 carries is not a lot, but on those 56 carries, he had 470 yards and 7 touchdowns. So he basically, every 8 touches, he averaged a touchdown. For every 8 touches, he got a touchdown. And he averaged almost, what is that? 8 yards a carry? 7 yards a carry? So he was very impactful, for the limited carries that he got, considering, he was the backup to a guy who got almost nearly 200 carries in 11 games. So, he's a guy that, is a 1,000-yard. He is a 1,000-yard guy. I don't think there's any doubt that, that's a number that he's going to get to. The only question is, how high can his season go? And his second banana is going to be his cousin, and so that's going to be that makes for a fun little twist to the backfield and the carries. Grant, I guess it's pronounced Yurkis. Grant Yurkis, who's a sophomore, his cousin is coming into the season. If Jack is 1A, he's going to be 1B, because they're planning on doing a lot of 2-back sets, so they'll be on the field at the same time. But it's one of those deals where you could see them sort of maybe potentially being that those go-to guys of back and forth, hot hand, just who gets the carries in certain situations. But so it's just so interesting when you look at all these positions. I could throw names out all over the place because there's just so many variables, I think, this year, to where you can't say, well, if Sherman can stop Jadarian Price, they're probably going to win. Or if this there's so many things that if this happens over here and that happens over there, it still might not mean that that's the difference in the game, because these other three things are going to be a bigger factor. So the question obviously is going to be, after Friday night, has Denison won its 10th in a row? Has Sherman got the axe for the first time since 2012? And there's just a lot of and honestly, I don't know if you flipped a coin 10 times, would that be a better advantage to see who comes away with the win in this game? So I'm looking forward to it. I know everybody's looking forward to it because it's Battle of the Axe, and I think it's going to be one of the more interesting games that we've had. Like I said, in at least 5 or 6 years, and we'll see who comes and wins it. We'll come back next week. We'll talk about that, all the other games, and all the other results from this week, and then what week 2 has in store for us as well. Again, I thank you for listening to the podcast. Like I said, it's going to come out every week, probably around Wednesday, and I hope you tune in. I hope you enjoy it, and we will talk to you next week.